Looks like a good place to start. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight's webinar, Filtered Through the Lens of a Camera. I am Jen Woodside, a director in Alumni Relations, and we're really pleased so many of you have watched these webinars in the past and continue to log in for these online programs. Please watch our website, your inbox, our social media, and we'll have a lot of updates about upcoming programs that are going to be happening through the next few months. We are joined today by Dan Bromberg, who is an associate professor of public administration in the Carsey School of Public Policy and the Department of Political Science at UNH. He is the director of academic programs for the Carsey School, and his research interests include government procurement, performance management, and organizational accountability. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Albany, an MPA from UVM, and then holds a PhD from the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University. He is joined by Étienne Charbonneau, who is the Canada Research Chair in Comparative Public Management. We're going to see how I do with this at École Nationale Publique in Montreal, Canada. His research focuses on citizen satisfaction, accountability, and electronic surveillance. He earned his bachelor and master's degree from the University of Laval and holds a PhD from the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers as well. So I took 4 years of French, and I feel like I did okay there, getting through that. So thank you for bearing with me. So we are going to have questions and answer periods throughout the webinar. So please just look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A box where you can put in a question. There might be a time that we will have comments. So just take note of that, and it will come up later in the webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen. Much appreciated. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. We hope that the topic is interesting to everyone and it engages everyone. And as Jen said, please feel free to throw out questions throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to answer those questions throughout. So just to give you some framing and some reference, what we're sharing with you today is part of a larger book project that Étienne and I are working on. So we kind of grabbed some snips from that project to present and share with you all. We talk about body-worn cameras as a tool for accountability. We talk about trust a little bit. And we're looking at this both from a police chief's perspective and from citizen perspective. So our goal with this bigger project really was to think about body-worn cameras and their relationship to accountability. You'll see a little bit of that in here. We don't get too far into the weeds though. So hopefully we keep it at a level that is interesting and compelling for everyone. So once again, feel free to jump in with questions and we'll get going. So as we rethink 21st century policing, we have to make changes that can increase transparency and accountability to make everyone safe. So this was said by U.S. Congressman Greg Stanton, who was the former mayor of Phoenix, and he was one of the sponsors of the Cops Accountability Act. And this was in reference to the nationwide implementation of body-worn cameras. So these two words here, transparency and accountability, really imply quite a bit. And they put a lot of weight into what body-worn cameras are, presumed to be able to do. And we question that. Our research, not only this research, but previous research, we really want to dig into whether or not body-worn cameras can fulfill that goal, right? So do body-worn cameras achieve this goal, this very lofty goal as we see it? And we just want to kind of give you guys a lay of the land. So on the left-hand side there, you see current laws applicable to body-worn cameras. And that's just things that were already on the books, laws that were already on the books. And on the right-hand side, you see laws specific to body-worn cameras. This is a dashboard that's available through the Urban Institute. It's not live right now, but if you were to go to the Urban Institute and check this out, you could scroll over any of these boxes here, and it will take you to direct links to pending legislation, various rules that affect body-worn cameras. But I think, most importantly from our perspective is there is a lot of variation. There's really not much consistency across the board here. You see it a little bit here and there, but overall there's a lot of variation. And the reason that is because local jurisdictions, both states and municipalities and cities, are frequently making the rules as to how body-worn cameras are implemented. And it's within those jurisdictions and within that discretion that's often held by a police chief or possibly a judge, or potentially a governor's office, right? That we see all of this variation. And to fulfill that calling for transparency and accountability, it's really challenging to do on a national level when all of this variation is taking place at the state level. So what did we do? So Étienne and I sent out 3 surveys. 2 of them were experimental designs, and we'll talk about them. And 1 of them was a qualitative design. We surveyed police chiefs. We surveyed US residents in Seattle, Charlotte, Los Angeles, and nationwide. And we did a qualitative survey of police chiefs nationwide. And I'll kind of get into those details, and Étienne will jump in. And Étienne, feel free to jump in whenever you'd like, and I'll stop.
Yeah, so just if you go back one slide. So why these 3 cities? Because these are the cities that in the academic literature, in the practitioner literature, in police magazines, all the time, these are the 3 examples that come on, and sometimes in the same breath, sometimes in the same paragraph, they say, these are the 3 kind of models that we have, and we'll get into them. But Seattle, it's a model that is pretty transparent, as pretty much as transparent as they come when it comes to big cities, where it doesn't take time. Video, like body-worn cameras, they film something, they will share it. It's not that long. Los Angeles is a bit longer, like sometimes 45 days to eventually, this is the limit to see the footage. And because it's Hollywood, they will edit it nicely. They will stop the action. You have a narrator explaining, right now, the officer is doing such and such because, the guidelines, they will explain it away. And Charlotte, well, Charlotte is on the other end of the spectrum, and usually it's presented as quite opaque, not quite as transparent as other cities in the US.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we get closer to the citizen research that we did. But they are your prototypical examples of the various extremes of policy of the policy implementation. So first, this police chief survey. So we sent the survey to over 6,000 police chiefs. Received about a 10% usable responses. Received a little bit more than that in responses, a little over 1,000 responses. But once we kind of did a few checks, we wanted to make sure that they actually completed the experiment properly. We landed with about 700, give or take. The chiefs received 1 or 2 videos of a police encounter with the use of lethal force. So these were training videos shot in Canada. No one was injured in the shooting of these videos. We are going to share these with you. So that's just fair warning. We're gonna share both of those videos so you can see what we shared with the police chiefs. There's no sound associated with them. They're both about a minute each. The second video you'll see is a little shaky. That was just in downloading it to my PC. The original video wasn't shaky, so you don't need to think about that as part of this. So let me share those videos with you now. So the first one is the body-worn camera video. and that is where that video ends. And the second one,
yeah, it's usually not that. It's usually not that blockish. There's something with the rhythm, like the police chief. They saw something much more fluid. I don't know. I think maybe it's too much.
I think in the download it just got a little shaky. And this one is a little shaky too, as I said. But the police chiefs did receive a bit more of a crisper video. So this is from the smartphone capture. So you're able to see both views there. So now keep in mind, police chiefs, half of them received both of those videos. Half of them only received the body-worn camera video. The chiefs also received a framing paragraph, and I'll just let you all read this yourself. It's a relatively long paragraph. I won't read it to you. So the idea with this paragraph was to take a chief outside of their own policy decision-making world and have them give some advice to a colleague. And this type of stuff happens regularly, right? There are working groups where stuff like this happens. So our goal here was to have a colleague give advice. Should I release this video or not? And this was given to the police chiefs that only received the body-worn camera video. That was all they received. However, there was a second set, like we said, that received this framing paragraph. And the only difference here is that bolded and underlined section. So in this case, the chiefs received the body-worn camera video, but they also received the smartphone video. And it was noted that the smartphone video was already circulating throughout the public, right? So local media outlets had already had this smartphone video. So one important point to keep in mind here is that police chiefs no longer had control over whether or not they would release the video. They no longer held that power to release or not to release the footage. Whereas in the first scenario, they still held that control. We then asked the chiefs, what would you most likely suggest your colleague do with the video footage? I would not recommend releasing the footage. I would recommend releasing the raw footage of the encounter immediately. I would recommend releasing the raw footage of the encounter to the public once an internal investigation is over. I would recommend releasing a stylized version of the footage of the encounter where a police officer narrates what is going on. And that's reminiscent of LAPD, which Étienne had just mentioned earlier, as far as how LAPD does this. All of these really do demonstrate the different policy options, right? So I would not recommend releasing the footage is really what we see in North Carolina pretty frequently. You ultimately need a court order typically to get a video released. Whereas Seattle tends to release the raw footage pretty immediately. And then a whole bunch of departments have internal investigations first. So I'm kind of curious, and Jen, if anyone is jumping in, I'm kind of curious what you all think the police chiefs would have responded. So if you don't mind putting in your answers in your Q&A, if anyone wants to throw in some answers as far as what do you think the police chiefs recommended here? Where do you think most of them landed? And I'm assuming, Jen, we're getting such a flood of responses that it's going to be hard to filter them out.
The result will be known in 3 days once they're counted.
Yeah, oh, they're coming in. Yep. So most of them are don't release. Some are released after the internal is over. And there is a few that are saying recommended releasing the raw footage once an investigation is over.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. So keep those in mind, right? Keep those in mind for what you thought the police chief should do. And we'll kind of go back to that towards the end of the presentation as well. So this is what our police chief said. And what you see here, go ahead, Étienne.
Yeah, so just to keep in mind, so we're always present 2 sets of results. One for the police chiefs that saw that the only version of the events were the ones they had, the body-worn cameras. This is the dark column there. And the lighter gray, these are the ones that had their own footage, but there's already that, the other one, the smartphone one, running around on the media. So there's already another version right now. It's a question of putting their own version there or not. And because these 2 versions, police chiefs were assigned to them at random by luck of the draw, we can deduce if there's a big enough difference that the difference in their preferences is due because the second version already exists. So we can kind of narrow down the effect of you no longer have total control of the footage, documenting the encounter.
And ultimately, we didn't really find this difference that Étienne's talking about.
Differences are rather small.
Yeah, the differences are relatively small. They're not statistically significant. So that control, that experiment, did not demonstrate that there'd be any differences. However, this was kind of only part of what we were looking at. We were actually more interested in how trust factors into the release of the footage. So every chief was asked various questions, these various scales that are used in the research regularly and tested regularly as to their various levels of trust. And we're going to share with you just one of those scales related to citizen trust. So here's what we would think is one of our most interesting findings. If the video is circulating on social media already, so in the group where those police chiefs received the 2 videos, the smartphone and the other one, and the smartphone was circulating on social media, trust is insignificant. It didn't matter at all. However, if there's only a BWC video, then trust is a significant predictor of a police chief's decision. So when we're comparing, should they release the footage immediately versus do not release the footage at all? The question for us was, how influential is trust? Now, keep in mind, this is only in scenarios where police chiefs have full control whether or not a video is going to be released. If a police chief trusts the residents in their community, they are 48% more likely to release the footage. 48% more likely to release the footage immediately as opposed to not releasing the footage if they trust the residents in their community. For us, this is a pretty important finding, right? The implication here is that maybe body-worn cameras aren't necessarily what we need to be working towards, but trust is a factor that we really need to be thinking about. And that's not to say that people aren't thinking about trust, but to some degree, a body-worn camera implies just the opposite, right? It implies that we need to see what the other is doing because we don't trust that their action. And there are many reasons as to why that might be the case on both sides of the equation. But 48% more likely is a pretty large finding there.
Dan, we have a few questions that are asking about what you're saying right now.
Sure.
So one is trust the community in what way? And the other is, what do you mean by trust in the residents? Trust them to do something or react in a certain way?
Yeah, they're good questions. I don't have the entire scale to share with you. But essentially what we do, Étienne, would you mind explaining the scale?
Yeah, so scales, they're typical battle-tested questions in research that are used again and again. So these try to cover as many aspects as possible of trust in residents in determining policy, in being fair judges of what you do, of being able to, trying to rely on them to give you tips, all these kind of think many dimensions of possible ways. And by memory, I think it was 6 items, different ways to, for police chiefs that they can say, yeah, I would mostly agree, disagree on all these different elements. And we put them together to give us one overall trust index for residents.
So it might say, do you trust the residents in your community to perform a certain task? Do you think the residents in your community evaluate policing fairly? And it goes through a series of questions. And we also did this for the police, their own organization, and we also did it for the media, which we're not sharing right now. So it's a series of questions, and then you're able to distill the level of trust from those questions. And Étienne and I didn't create these questions, right? These questions have been in the literature and tested time and time again to demonstrate that they actually do give an indicator of trust.
Yes.
Does that answer that question, Jen?
Yes, I think they were just looking for a little bit more information on what that,
Sure.
The trust meant there. Perfect.
Sure. So that's what we're kind of talking about with police chiefs. And a few other points we could just note before I jump to the citizen survey. This was also the same if police chiefs trusted their officers. So, and I believe it was 68%. So you replace that 48% more likely with 68%. If a police chief trusted his own officers or her own officers, the likelihood that they would release the footage increased dramatically. So in both instances, when a police chief has full discretion to disclose the footage, trust played a really monumental role.
Yeah, and the last one was trust in the media, and there the dynamic was a little bit different for police chiefs. So when they trusted the media, they didn't feel they had to release the information right away. They felt comfortable waiting after the internal investigation, and they were not fearing that the media, and that scale, I remember, it was 16 items, really specific. And then they were kind of okay. The media is not going to do an unfair job. They're not going to speculate. They're going to wait. And so if they were trusting the media, local media there, they were okay with waiting for the internal investigation. So it was different dynamics than the trust in their own officer and the trust in their citizen.
Okay, I'm going to now run through the citizen residents, the U.S. resident survey, and I'll kind of hit on just a few of the key points that we looked at. So it won't take that long, and then we're happy to open it up to Q&A and have a broader discussion. So as we said, we sent the survey to U.S. residents in LA, Charlotte, Seattle, and just a general sample of U.S. residents. We sent it to, we had responses of 1,000 in each city. And as Étienne explained earlier, each of these cities really represent the difference in policy implementation. So as a reminder, LA releases a stylized version of the footage. They'll do a voiceover narration, and they'll produce it a little bit more. Charlotte tends to not release footage unless it is done through a court order. And Seattle tends to be very transparent. You know, within 24, 48 hours, something along those lines, they will post it online. So these cities offer a range of policies related to the release of BWC footage. And this was the framing paragraph we gave to US residents. And just to kind of break it down for you, essentially, we describe exactly what happened in that police stoppage that you saw in the BWC and smartphone footage. However, in this, we had broken this sample down into 4 different groups, and each group received something different. So 40% were just given the BWC video. So they saw this, the police chief gave a press conference, and then the police chief released the video. That was given to 40% of our respondents. However, 20% were told that the perpetrator suffered from mental illness and his family had requested that it not be released, and that the law enforcement was going to comply with that. They were going to respect that decision. 20% were told that there was an internal investigation taking place, and once the investigation is complete, then they'll make a determination. And 20% were told the officer failed to activate his camera, and therefore they were unable to release any footage. And essentially, we're testing how these resonate with these different groups. And we're interested here into that second part, right? That transparency part of that original quote that I shared. Go ahead, Étienne.
Yes, so just to make sure, in this one, it's not one video or 2. It's one video for 40% or 0, no video at all, just the explanation. And for the 60% left, so the 20-20-20, there are 3 different reasons why they'll never see, or maybe they have to wait depending for the video, but why they cannot see it right now. So it's not 50-50, it's 40-60. So 40% saw the video and 60% just had the description given that you saw before.
And what we said to them was, please indicate your level of agreement with the chief's handling of the body-worn camera footage. And every group received that. And this is what we saw. So this is the distribution of our results. And ultimately, while they were skewed somewhat differently, the median still falls in agreement with how the chief handled the footage.
Yeah, so the way to read a box like this, so the big fat line in the middle, this is the median. This is like when it's the number of distribution, it's like the average. It's really like it's the middle of the pack. And when you see the top of the box and the bottom, this is the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. So when you look, for example, in LA, no release, did not activate, you see that the mean and the average, they're lower. And you see that the 25% is somewhat dissatisfied, like it goes that low. And then there's some other ones there. But you can see that for across the 4 samples there, in the US, Seattle, LA, and Charlotte, the ones who cannot see it because it did not activate, these people were not happy with how the police chiefs handled the situation, because they were never going to see the video. There's no video to be seen. And when depending, there were some differences. People were not pleased, where the reason why they couldn't see the video was for a mental health issue or because of the investigation pending. But when there's a internal investigation, eventually they will see it. Mental health, some people, they could convince them, okay, maybe there's a reason. But when they know that there was a camera and it didn't activate, which happened in South Bend a few years ago, people are not pleased at all throughout the board.
And the other thing that you notice here is that regardless of where people are, the results are pretty consistent. So, often we think that local policies reflect the local populace. But in this case, US in general and these 3 cities really all look very similar in their responses. We then asked them on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being not transparent and 10 being extremely transparent, please rate the police department's level of transparency in disclosing information about this incident. And once again, you'll see pretty remarkable consistency. And as Étienne explained, that line.
Yeah, and people actually see the video, the 40%. They find it much more transparent, obviously, than not seeing them. But we were interested, the 3 reasons for not seeing them, which one would be more palatable, more understandable. And usually mental health is the one, okay, I'm not seeing it right now, but I can sort of understand why. But again, when it doesn't activate, you know, this is something where sometimes like the median or a significant minority of citizens will be very distressed about.
And you will notice once again that the median still falls above that midpoint.
Yes.
Right. So in general, right, people are still suggesting that there is a level of transparency, regardless of whether or not the footage is immediately displayed. This is interesting, right? In that right now we're hearing a lot of demand that we have to display the footage. And which of the following statements best captures your opinions of how police departments should release footage? So this is kind of a throwback to that first question that we asked police chiefs and that all of you participated in and then answered. And I'm going to come back to this chart as our last slide, so I'll spend some more time on it then. But you can see a good amount of people fall within the police department should release raw footage of the encounter once an internal investigation is over. So this is a breakdown by race and ethnicity. So I'll give you guys a second to take a look at this. Étienne, do you want to jump in and kind of describe this a little bit?
Yeah, so as we said before, overall, when we see the numbers that on the previous slide that were representative of what, you know, the composition of the city in the US at large, almost most people, the favorite option is to wait. They're okay to see the footage once the internal investigation is over. This is true overall, and maybe 20–25% of them would rather, you know, when the other number would rather see the raw footage right away, immediately.
So that's this one right here, this one here, right? Yes. Or release the raw footage.
Yeah, but what we think is interesting is the last option, like the police department should release the raw footage immediately. This, for people of color, way higher than for white people.
So you'll see the discrepancy here. Essentially, the same percent of people of color would prefer to see the footage released immediately, as opposed to white or Caucasian people being willing to wait after an internal investigation. And that is consistent here, here, and here, here, and here. And that finding really looks quite different from anything else that we found throughout the rest of our results. And to really just drive that point home a little bit further, you'll see here where police chiefs are with the release of raw footage of the encounter after an internal investigation, or the release of raw footage of the encounter immediately, right? 48%, nearly half of them want to wait until after the internal investigation, right? Whereas only 12% are willing to release the raw footage immediately. Well, look at these differences. If you're a person of color living within the United States, you believe that raw footage should be released immediately. And there's a major discrepancy there between that 12% of those police chiefs and the 40%. However, if you're white and living within the United States, you actually look, your responses are actually quite similar to the police chiefs. So when we're looking at these divides and we're trying to understand some of these barriers, these factors are really important for us to consider. And the wants and desires and needs of people look different depending on how they view this situation and what their relationship is with law enforcement in their community. So we're hopeful that this is helpful in further understanding this. So the qualitative study that I talked about, you guys will just have to buy the book because we—
that's the best part, which is too bad, because the police chiefs there, they really share. We ask them to explain like how it changed the way they're policing, the relationship with the community, their officers, and they dish it out. It's amazing.
So that's a good preview for everyone. We're happy to answer questions and discuss some of the findings we had from our qualitative study. But obviously much longer format and take a bit longer to go through. Étienne and I are both scholars of public administration, which means that we study how policies are implemented, how citizens react to those policies, how career officials try to implement and address some of those concerns of residents. So for us, this doesn't work unless there's something that is applicable at the end of it. So we hope that, with our research that we do have some findings that are applicable, and that we understand that trust is, a really important factor here. And that while body-worn cameras are certainly a component of this equation, without that trusting relationship, we're going to really still have a number of challenges to face with law enforcement and their community members. And with that, we're happy to open it up and take some questions from all of you.
All right, yes, questions are definitely coming in. So let me just look here. So the first one is, did you control for jurisdictions, agencies that have personnel investigation restrictions included in collective bargaining agreements? That would be an important thing to control for in that question as to what the response is to the public regarding release of footage.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I'll kind of answer that in a couple different ways, and then Étienne will probably correct me and answer it in a third way. So first, the research kind of response is the experiments are completely random. So in both of those groups, there are the same exact number of jurisdictions that would have those union restrictions versus the ones that would not have those union restrictions. So in theory, it shouldn't really matter. They should balance each other out, and that's kind of our methodological response. The more practical response and how we tried to get around that, and obviously you got to take it with a grain of salt, right? I mean, it is what it is we tried to position it so it wasn't based on their own policies, and we tried to position it as a pilot project of the other department. And we wanted them to give feedback to their colleague. And that is very, purposeful as to why we did not ask them to talk about their own policies. So those are my two responses. But no question, it's a really important point.
Okay, so the next question is, how much are they, and I assume this means the police chiefs, allowed to edit the video footage before it is released to the public?
I mean, how much are they allowed to edit it? Is that the question?
Yeah, I guess maybe they're asking, are there laws or is there standard procedures?
It really depends on where you are. There's certainly certain disclosure laws, and I'm sure there are some attorneys on this that probably could answer that even better than I can. It depends on the jurisdiction that you're in. And there are different ways to edit that footage, right? So there may be, most videos, if not all videos, are first going through privacy checks. So do they need to blur out any faces? Is there anyone underage captured on that? Is there anyone that could have some harm, caused to them because they're on the video? Any number of questions like that, and adjustments are made there. So there are any number of different edits that may take place. I'm not aware of any guiding, law that would say you cannot edit a video whatsoever. Sometimes these do end up in court, and a judge might order a specific type of edit for the protection of an individual.
Okay, so the next question is, let's see, what do you feel like comes into play in a situation like Portland, where these mysterious police come in from the federal government and there's no chance of seeing any footage? I guess it's more saying, is there no chance of seeing any footage?
I'm not, I wouldn't want to claim to know too much. I mean, and Étienne, please feel free to jump in. I mean, my understanding is that, those federal, I really can't comment on that too much. I don't think.
These federal agents, many times now their discussion for the longest time, federal agents could not have body-worn cameras. And there were some issues if they were doing a joint operation with, let's say, state troopers, where state troopers would have them, but the federal agents are not supposed to be filmed and they're not having them. So what do we do? There were questions like this. I know there were discussions now to start maybe letting some of them in certain restricted circumstances have them, but usually federal agents did not need to have them.
Yeah, and that is changing, right? I mean, that has changed certainly since the George Floyd incident, where federal officers are now wearing body-worn cameras. Whether or not we would see those, I don't know.
But even in the local level, and sometimes county level or state level, again, it changes. It's all over the map, like the different variations of policies there. But many times SWAT teams would not have them. And the thinking is, we don't want someone asking to see the videos and then know how SWAT teams operate, because there will be some people probably in their basement that will pour over them and make sure to know the way it's going to happen if they're planning something bad when they might encounter them. And we know, like in Louisville, what happened was there was a raid like this. So they had cameras there. It was on the SWAT team, but when it's SWAT teams, and sometimes mistakes happen then. They're not all. Sometimes local policies would say everyone needs to have a camera, but SWAT teams don't. Or like internal affairs, sometimes they don't. Or obviously people that are I'm looking for my words in English right now, pretending to be bad guys, like undercover. It's going to be very suspicious if you have a camera, like you don't have to do it to have them. But usually the federal level, I don't think you would see them.
All right, so the next question is a little long, so let me see if I can get through it. But it says that the listener has a major concern with video and audio, and that body-worn cameras often sketchy and catching important details or body language, and that bystander video also can be the same way. How is one to know that bystander footage isn't edited before being released to the press? It would be naive to think people don't have an agenda when releasing bystander footage to the press.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. I mean, I'll give you kind of a couple of interesting tidbits kind of related to that. The gentleman that provided those videos to us, he's done a number of different projects related to videos, but one of them is the idea of camera bias. So when a camera is positioned, say in the corner of a room and captures the footage, people will perceive that differently than if the same exact footage is captured on the chest of a police officer from a body-worn camera. They'll believe the officer should have acted differently depending on the view of the camera. So regardless if the smartphone video is edited or not, there are different perspectives, and they're going to draw out different responses from people. So we know that happens. The other kind of interesting thing that's happening, and Étienne, you might be able to speak to this a little more than I am, Axon, which is one of the largest providers of body-worn cameras, they now have a citizen portal. And essentially what you do is you then turn that smartphone footage into the citizen portal. So they keep record of that as well. And obviously there are, positives and negatives related to that. but that would help stop any editing of that footage.
Wow, that's interesting. Are there certain areas of the country that are more likely to release body cam footage, in your knowledge, like North, South, Midwest, etc.?
I don't think so, but I can't say for sure. I kind of have to, I tend to look at that map pretty regularly and go through those policies, and they change frequently. I think as the first question, the first participant asked about the unions related to body-worn cameras, that tends to be something that is popping up a good amount, right? So union contracts, personnel contracts, will often stipulate that cameras are part of personnel files, which is the case in North Carolina. Personnel files are not always accessible. They're typically not accessible through Freedom of Information requests. So that's a tactic that allows law enforcement agencies not to disclose some of that footage. Often you'll see footage can't be randomly audited either, right? So only if there has been a use of force incident or a citizen complaint could that footage be accessed. So, for example, if smoking a cigarette in a cruiser is, against law enforcement policy, and the camera picks up an officer smoking a cigarette, that's not something that you would actually be able to do anything with, right? You're not going to say that you're against department policy because you did that. So there are certainly restrictions, and the truth is they're all over the place across the country.
All right. The next question is, what was the most surprising result to you?
For me, and yeah, go ahead, Étienne.
Yeah, and again, I lived in the US. I mean, you can't hear it right now with my Jersey accent, but I lived in the US for years. And to me, like the United States, they have this, it's a strong tradition to have state rule, local preferences, federal government, sometimes tell us what to do, but it's all about what we want. And, we experiment and we don't want to be told how to do our things. So these different policies, we thought maybe they would reflect local preferences. And especially like the last table there where we showed you like police chiefs, white people and people of color. Look at the numbers, like let's say like not release the footage, 10.7, 10.8, 10.9, 8. These are really close numbers. Like, and you look at them, and they're really, really similar. A few percentage points here and there, they're really similar. And I didn't know there was such a consensus in the US for preferences of when and how to see the footage. I thought there'd be really big variation, and that the police chiefs in LA or Seattle and Charlotte, they know what their their population want, and somehow through politicians and they got, or maybe sheriffs around them, like they got an idea, this is what our citizens know. And we had one police chief early on in another project that really took the time after a study to write us a really thoughtful email. It was saying, policing is done exactly, there's so many checks, and we have to be attuned to preferences. Citizens get the policing they want. This is whatever they get, this is what they want, because we live in a democracy. And it was very well explained. And maybe his department did it this way, but for the cities we tested, when we surveyed their citizens, this is not what we found. So this to me like really surprised me. But again, I'm not American.
No, it's a really good point, right? So the consistency across the United States was pretty remarkable. Obviously, the data related to people of color versus white people was striking, and I think a pretty important finding. We didn't share the qualitative survey, information with you, but essentially these were paragraphs that police chiefs wrote for us, sometimes longer than that. We basically asked them how body-worn cameras have affected their relationships with the community and their relationships with their officers. And more often than not, the body-worn camera is being used to dismiss citizen complaints. That was by far the most common response from police chiefs, that they use them to basically dismiss citizen complaints in a relatively efficient manner. So that to me was surprising, in that law enforcement uses body-worn cameras to hold citizens accountable. Citizens believe, or US residents believe, that they're using body-worn cameras to hold police accountable. This indicates that there might be a problem, but it also suggests that there could be progress made, in that conversation, whatever happens between that, that police chief, and we had police chiefs say, I'll pick up the phone and call a citizen and say, hey, are you sure I have the footage? In that conversation, I think progress can be made. So for me, that was a pretty striking finding.
This next question kind of plays off of that. Were the police chiefs open to these kind of discussions, or did you feel like they were guarded?
No, I thought they were completely open. To the extent, I had police chiefs calling me, almost when we first put the survey out. This was February-ish, right? January, February, I think somewhere along there. So prior to the most recent incidents, but certainly not prior to, many of the things that happened over the last 5 years. I had police chiefs calling me and discussing this. The qualitative responses we received were thoughtful, long format responses. They definitely engaged. We ended up with, so we showed you all results from 700. We have another, 500 results from the qualitative study that we did from a different set of police chiefs. So, in research like this, while it may not seem like a great response rate, it's a pretty good response rate to get, 10% of your respondents in a very specific, job with a lot of responsibility, a lot of time spent working to respond to surveys like this. So yes, I would say that they were engaged.
All right, we have one final question here. Do you think the rise of iPhone camera footage and people taking those videos is based on the distrust by people of color that body cam footage will ever make it out, or is it just based on more people have iPhones and cameras now?
I'd be speculating.
Yeah, but there's a dynamic that is, to me, is interesting. So what happened with Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the biggest city next to it? Help me, Dan.
Where are you?
In Missouri. I'm having my Missourian geography there. So the biggest city next to it, after all these years, they still don't have body cams. So, and even if you have them in Minnesota, there was footage, and it took many months to see it. In Louisville right now, there is footage. There was something released today after the fact, but during the fact, we have, there is footage existing, and we don't have it. So just because it was filmed doesn't mean automatically everywhere that the footage will be seen. And if the footage is not shared eventually, it's one thing to wait for the internal investigation, but if you don't see it, then these promises of transparency, accountability are harder to get behind. If there's footage that is not shared with the public, then it can be, it can be used to hold citizens to account. But if the public never see it, it's harder for citizens to hold police officers in account in the rare cases where something really bad happens.
Yeah, there's an assumption that transparency leads to accountability, and that's possibly a false assumption, and if anything, it's certainly an unproven assumption. Transparency doesn't necessarily lead to accountability, nor does transparency lead to trust. So whether or not people are filming because they don't trust, sure, I think that's potentially the case. That said, law enforcement are also filming, once again, what I would point to is that we really shouldn't be catering towards surveillance. We should be trying to create trust within our communities and investing in trust within our communities. And that's a much longer, harder road to go down. And that's not to say that body-worn cameras shouldn't be used. I think that they can be a tool that can be effective, but there's clearly much harder work that needs to happen within certain communities.
All right. That was the last question, and I feel like that was a good way to end as well. That was some interesting information. So we are going to wrap this up. I did want to let you know that we will send out a follow-up email that will have some more details and some resources that we can provide for you to kind of dive deeper into this if you want. And it will also be listed in our webinar library if you feel like there's anybody else that would be interested in watching. We will have that up in a couple days, and I will send along the link to that as well if you want to share it with people. So thank you so much to both of you. We'll have to have you back after the book is out so you can share the rest of that information, but this was great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.